Welcome to Mississippi, 1918, where the night hangs heavy and the river remembers more than it should. They said the Great War ended across an ocean, but here far from the trenches, another war waited, older, slower, and buried beneath the silt. Lieutenant James Corbett was 26 when they sent him south with a handful of men and a set of maps that no longer matched the land. The floodwaters had rewritten everything. His orders were simple: chart new routes for supply barges. But on their third patrol, the river answered back. A deep metallic breathing rose from below. Then a long scrape against the hull, slow testing, almost curious. 2 nights later, the first patrol vanished. Their boat was found half buried in mud rifles stacked neatly by the wheel steel plates ripped inward. Corbett went down himself, rope at his waist, lantern in hand. 9 minutes passed. When he surfaced, his face was the color of ash. It moved, he whispered, and never spoke of it again. By August, boats disappeared without trace. The water grew warm to the touch, thick, pulsing, as though it had a heartbeat. Locals spoke of lights under the surface, drifting like ghostly lanterns. Fishermen swore the fog hummed before the silence came. Corbett stopped filing reports. He was seen at night, hand pressed to the railing, listening to something deep below. "It's not done with us," he murmured. Soon even the insects stopped singing. The herons fled. The river turned still as if waiting. Soldiers heard tapping beneath their boats. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. One answered back. By morning, his bunk was empty sheets soaked through. By September, the docks corroded overnight iron bleeding into the water. Corbett's final log read, "It watches from below. We've built our roads over its grave." The next day, he was gone. His lantern still burned in his tent, low but alive. They closed the section of river after that. On maps, it's just a nameless bend. But locals still whisper of the night stalker, the thing that learned the sound of engines, the pulse of oars, the warmth of men. They say when the fog rolls in, the water hums like something remembering, and if you listen closely, you can hear it breathing back. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and what time it is as you listen. Because if you're near running water right now, maybe it's listening too. August 1918. The Delta steamed under a leaden sky. The war in Europe had devoured nearly a generation, but here in the American South, the air was heavy with another kind of silence, the kind that followed storms, funerals, or secrets too old to name. Trains passed through Vicksburg, carrying crates of ammunition, bound for the ports. Rifles, shells, spare engines. But most nights, the sound of locomotives was drowned out by the chorus of insects rising from the wetlands. The Mississippi backwaters weren't marked on any proper map. They shifted each season, swallowing farmland and birthing new islands of mud. It was a place that changed shape when you looked away. A place that didn't like to be measured. The Army Corps of Engineers kept a small outpost near the levee, a cluster of tin-roof shacks, an operations tent, and a narrow pier that jutted into black water. The men stationed there were river watchers, surveyors, and repair crews. None of them were soldiers in the usual sense, no trenches, no gunfire, just mud, humidity, and the endless hum of diesel. They spoke in low voices after dark. Some said the river had moods, that it rose and fell with the blood of men fighting overseas. Others said it was older than that it had been a battlefield long before any flag flew over it. Lieutenant James Corbett was among the few who kept records. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of penmanship learned before the war. The first pages of his log read like any officer's inspection: complete, current steady, fog thick after sundown. But as the weeks dragged on, the notes changed tone. The lines grew shorter, clipped, filled with ellipses, unidentified vibration beneath hull, not mechanical, repeating at intervals. 2:14 a.m. To a historian, the entries read like fragments of data. To anyone else, they sounded like confessions. The locals who lived along the river knew that tone well. They'd heard it before in 1871, when the Great Flood carved new scars into the land. In 1903, when entire barges vanished without a trace. They called it the old breath, a superstition whispered across generations. Every few decades, something beneath the river stirred, and the water turned warm as blood. Church bells in town rang longer those summers. Coffins were sealed tighter. And the river towns waited, always waited for the thing to pass. In the summer of 1918, waiting wasn't enough. The war pulled every young man who could hold a rifle. Those who stayed were the ones too old, too wounded, or too haunted. They filled the river posts, men who'd seen death before and didn't fear it anymore. But death here was different. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It crept underfoot through the reeds and the fog through the channels that no one could chart. Some nights men swore they saw shadows move against the moonlight. Not boats, not animals, but shapes that glided just below the surface, leaving ripples too slow for wind. The newspapers said nothing. The local press didn't print panic during wartime. The headlines were filled with victory drives and Liberty Bonds with photographs of smiling recruits and flags flapping above factories. But behind those headlines there were letters the kind families kept folded in drawers, written in smudged pencil from river camps along the delta. One read, "Ma, tell them not to send any more of us down here. The river's not right. It hums at night." Another simply said, "Tell the preacher to bless the water." Across the levee, civilians lived close enough to hear the engines start at dusk and the silence that followed hours later. They learned to measure time by that silence, how long it lasted, how deep it felt. A farmer near Yazoo said he saw a boat's searchlight flicker once, twice, then vanish as if swallowed by smoke. He found the beam again reflected on the underside of the clouds, a pale ring like an eye opening in the sky. He moved his family inland the next morning. Officially, the Corps listed 4 incidents that summer, 3 missing patrols, and 1 equipment failure. Unofficially, locals counted 9. Records vanished. Reports contradicted each other. The Army blamed sabotage, German agents, black market smugglers, river pirates. No one could prove otherwise, and maybe that was the point. The mystery became safer than the truth. Corbett's superior captain, Elias Monroe, filed a memo on September 3rd. The language was precise, bureaucratic, possible hydrostatic instability in lower channels. Recommend suspension pending environmental survey. But scribbled at the bottom, barely legible, was a single question in pencil. Who's making the noise? No one ever answered it. The nights turned longer as autumn neared. The heat didn't fade. The mosquitoes thickened like smoke. Men covered their skin in grease to keep from itching raw. And still they felt watched. They began to hear things, knocks on the hull, the faint echo of footsteps across the deck, though no one moved. Whispers that rose and fell with the current. Corbett ordered nightly checks, radio at every hour, engine tests, light sweeps across the water. None of it changed anything. One by one, his crew began requesting transfers. The last photograph taken at the outpost shows Corbett standing beside a half-sunken launch. The fog curls around his legs like fabric. He's looking past the camera out toward the bend. The image is grainy, but if you look closely, the water behind him isn't still. It bulges slightly, a dome rising beneath the surface caught mid-motion. The negative was lost soon after. By September's end, the river claimed the pier itself. It collapsed overnight, posts splintered and pulled downward, as if something had hooked them. The outpost was abandoned within days. The men left quietly, leaving equipment behind. Locals said they heard engines at night for weeks after engines from boats that no longer existed. Then, one evening, the sound stopped. Today, historians debate what happened there. Some call it folklore born of wartime exhaustion, a fever dream in the humid dark. Others, digging through the core archives, find too many missing pages to dismiss it so easily. The coordinates of that stretch of river were redacted for decades. Even now, pilots avoid it. The GPS reads fine, but compasses twitch and needles spin when you pass overhead. The water remains darker than the rest of the river, almost blue-black like ink. Fishermen call it Dead Man's Hollow, though the charts give it no name. And somewhere beneath that stillness, under layers of mud and time, lie the engines, the rifles, the men who vanished without a trace. Or perhaps if you listen long enough on certain nights, something else. Something that never left. The records that survived the summer of 1918 are scattered like the river itself, fragments, smudges, half-typed pages, and damp maps curled at the edges. What remains begins with numbers, dates, coordinates, and ends with silence. Between July 12th and September 2nd, 3 patrol launches disappeared. 15 men. No remains recovered. The files list them under non-combat operational losses, yet the tone of the dispatches changes with each line from discipline to unease until even the punctuation trembles. Engine malfunction, visibility poor, unidentified contact beneath hull. The ellipses are theirs, not mine. In one report, Lieutenant James Corbett's name appears in faded carbon. He notes pressure waves inconsistent with current, then adds almost as an afterthought sound resembles exhalation. The next page is missing. What follows is a replacement typed later in another hand survey incomplete. Personnel transferred, but the dates overlap, meaning someone rewrote time to close a case that was still happening. Official memoranda from the Corps of Engineers in Vicksburg mention metal fatigue and possible sabotage, yet the metallurgical tests contradict them. A plate of steel from Boat 17 bent inward, not torn, not burst as though squeezed. The Bureau of Standards marked it anomaly, mechanical stress, unclassified. In the margin, an analyst penciled a single question mark and never erased it. Another fragment stored in a wooden crate for decades weeps rust even today. Its surface blooms with a faint oily sheen that smells of salt, though the river has never known the sea. The log of the weather station upriver records a strange inversion that August surface water at 88 degrees Fahrenheit, depths near 95. No volcanic vents, no chemical discharge. Just warmth rising from below. The temperature corrected itself within weeks, but not before several divers reported tingling on their skin and vibrations through the spine. They wrote that it felt like standing beside a generator. Yet there was no generator for miles. Corbett's last radio message was received at 0216 hours, August 28th. Static, then a faint knocking, 3 pause 3. The operator logged it as equipment interference, but later when the tape was replayed at low speed, the knocks were followed by a sound almost like a breath taken through water. The War Department ordered the recording destroyed. 2 copies survived in private archives. Both end abruptly, as if the signal had been swallowed. When the Army reopened the river route in 1910, civilian contractors refused to work that sector. They said their engines misfired near the bend, that their compasses swung north when pointed west. A photographer named E.M. Dorsey, sent to document the reconstruction, captured an image of the damaged pier at sunrise. Behind the shattered posts, the water seems to rise in a single smooth curve, not a wave but a swelling from beneath. The negative cracked along that line. The archivist who handled it decades later wrote emulsion damage consistent with localized heat. No one could explain where the heat came from. In 1953, an academic from Tulane University, Helen Carter began compiling oral histories from families along the Delta. Most of the men she sought had died. Their sons repeated the same phrases, the river that hummed, the water that pushed back. One elderly woman recalled her father returning home after a patrol, his boots caked in black mud that steamed in the morning light. He told her not to wash them, only to bury them behind the barn. She did. Grass has never grown there since. Government archives confirm that a restricted coordinate zone, 32 to 21, N might say 56, W remained closed to dredging for more than 30 years. The reason cited: subsurface instability. Modern sonar surveys show a hollow beneath the riverbed, roughly 40 meters long, dome-shaped, with channels radiating outward like veins. Geologists call it a collapse cavity. Fishermen call it the heart. Among the correspondence filed in the winter of 1918 is a short letter from Captain Elias Monroe to a superior in Washington. We are unable to maintain crew morale. Men report auditory phenomena, thumping beneath hulls, humming through deck plates. Possible resonance from current, though the rhythm suggests pattern. Advise. No reply exists. When the influenza epidemic struck that autumn, the outpost was abandoned entirely. Equipment left behind corroded within weeks. Tools rusted from the inside out. The supply shack roof collapsed, its nails softened like wax. Samples sent to the Bureau of Chemistry showed no acid, no contaminant, only unknown oxidation catalyst. The file closes with a note in pencil: Haws could not be reproduced under laboratory conditions. Decades passed. Floods came and went. New roads cut across the old levees. Yet every time construction crews drilled near the forgotten coordinates, their machines overheated, gauges spiked, and the mud rose warm to the touch. Local foremen learned to move their lines elsewhere. Official reports called it geothermal variance. The workers called it the breathing ground. In 1974, when the Corps finally released its declassified survey logs, journalists found an appendix titled Unusual Acoustic Data. The graphs show low-frequency pulses recorded by experimental hydrophones, 6 to 8 cycles per minute, too slow for machinery, too regular for chance. The amplitude increased steadily before cutting off at 03:17 a.m., the same hour Corbett's patrol vanished 56 years earlier. One engineer interviewed much later said he could feel those pulses through the floor of the analysis room, even with the speakers off. The Mississippi has a long memory. Its water carries clay from centuries of floods, bones from forgotten wars, metal from every bridge that ever collapsed into it. But nothing else along its 200-300 miles hums like that stretch near Vicksburg. Locals say it still happens some nights. The frogs stop, the air grows heavy, and the river ripples without wind. A fisherman named Joseph Pryor swore he once felt the stern of his boat lift an inch as if something immense had rolled beneath. When he reached shore, the paint on the keel had blistered. He sanded it down, but the shape of a palm, broad, 5-fingered, oddly human, remained. The rational explanations have filled shelves: methane gas temperature, inversion, mechanical resonance, seismic echo. Each theory answers part of the riddle and leaves the rest untouched. The numbers keep returning: the heat, the hum, the pressure. Something repeats, something breathes. In the archived notebooks between the measurements and signatures, a phrase recurs in faint pencil from different hands and different years. Same sound again. No one ever proved what moved beneath the Mississippi that summer, and maybe proof was never the point. The river erased its witnesses, silted over its wrecks, folded their stories into the current, until all that remained was rhythm, thrum, pause, thrum. When you stand on the bank today, where the reeds whisper against the mud, you can still hear it faintly at the edge of the wind. Not legend, not machinery, just the heartbeat of something that refused to die. Isaac Turner lived most of his life on the river, born on it, married beside it, and by 1918 he knew every bend between the Yazoo and the Delta by the smell of the mud alone. He was 42 that summer, too old for war, too poor to leave. His house sat on stilts above a cove where the cypress roots tangled like black ropes, and on nights when the fog came rolling low, he could hear the patrol launches moving, the slow thump of diesel, the creak of wood, the voices of soldiers echoing off the flat water. He said the river talked back to them, not with words, but with sound, the deep, slow hum that rose from below the current and seemed to answer the engines note for note. He wasn't a man for stories. Most folks called him plain Isaac, quiet, hard-handed, always out before dawn, with a net slung over his shoulder. But after that August, he stopped fishing past sunset. In an interview recorded years later on a reel-to-reel tape, his voice quivers when he recalls that night, August 28, 1918, the night the fog never lifted. The Army had told civilians to stay inland, but the levee roads were half flooded, and Isaac's skiff was his only way home. He paddled slow, listening. Somewhere downriver, a patrol engine coughed, sputtered, then steadied that soft, rhythmic pulse he'd come to recognize. He was half a mile from the bend when the sound stopped. The air was thick enough to chew. The moon had vanished, the stars smothered. He said the river smelled different, metallic, sharp, like old coins. Then came the vibration, faint at first, through the hull of his skiff, then rising until it rattled his teeth. He thought it was thunder, but the sky was silent. Beneath him, the water began to ripple in perfect circles, spreading outward as though something beneath was breathing. He held his lantern low over the side. The light bounced off slick movement, not waves, not fish, just a slow roll of darkness passing beneath. It moved without sound, without hurry. Enormous. Isaac pulled his hand back from the water instinctively, and in that instant he heard it 3 knocks, pause, 3 again against the wooden ribs of his boat. He dropped the lantern. The flame hissed out as it hit the surface, leaving only blackness. What happened next lived in fragments. He said he saw a glow rise from the direction of the patrol, pale green, faint at first, then spreading until it lit the fog from within. Shapes moved inside that light, not clear, not human, more like silhouettes sliding past each other, merging, separating. The sound returned, not humming now, but low and rhythmic, a deep resonance that vibrated through the air. His skiff tilted with each pulse as if the river itself was exhaling beneath him. And then, silence. When the light faded, the patrol was gone. No wake, no debris, just the smell of oil drifting over still water. Isaac paddled backward without knowing it, his oar dipping soundless into what felt thicker than water. He said the fog closed around him like cloth, and somewhere inside it, something brushed the underside of his boat, slow, deliberate, almost gentle. When he reached the shallows, the skiff scraped against the mud, and he didn't look back. At dawn, he found the bank littered with reeds torn from their roots. The footprints in the mud weren't human, wide, smooth 5 impressions, like fingers pressed deep into the earth, each one filled with water that shimmered despite the morning sun. He took off his hat and stood there a long time. Then he walked to the nearest army checkpoint and told them what he'd seen. The soldiers listened, took notes, and sent him home. No one ever came to ask again. A week later, when the outpost was abandoned, Isaac went back. The pier was gone, splintered posts tilting into the current. He said the river looked darker than before, like ink poured over glass. He never fished that channel again. In his old age, when his eyesight began to fade, he built a porch facing away from the water. His grandson remembered that he'd startle at certain sounds, the thump of a car engine, the echo of rain in barrels, and go quiet for hours after. When asked about the war, he'd only say, The war didn't end here. It went under. He kept one thing from that night, a piece of wood from his skiff, split clean down the middle edges, smooth as if carved by a blade. It never rotted. When his family burned the rest of the boat for kindling, that one plank wouldn't catch flame. It only smoked. Years later, a historian found Isaac Turner's testimony among the files declassified in the 1970s, one yellowed page handwriting, steady, but pressed too hard into the paper. The water rose under the boat like something alive. I heard it breathe. Beneath the signature, an annotation in red pencil reads, "Subject unreliable, possible war hysteria." Yet the same folder contains a field photograph from that same night, an image of the bend taken by an unknown officer. The fog glows faintly along the horizon. In the lower corner, if you look closely, there's a ripple in the water, shaped like a hand reaching upward. Isaac died in 1949, the year the river flooded again. His house washed away, but neighbors swore his porch was the only piece of wood that floated upright all the way to the next county. They said it drifted against the current, slow, steady, like something following its own path back home. And sometimes, just sometimes on quiet nights when the fog rolls through the delta, fishermen still claim to hear it. The knock against their hulls. 3, pause, 3. Always from below. By the time autumn came, the files in Vicksburg had multiplied 3 drawers of charts, 9 folders of testimony, 1 locked cabinet of things that could not be classified. The river looked calm, yet every document carried the same small tremor in its lines, as if the ink itself had shaken. Day after day, the clerks typed stable, unchanged routine, but the paper smelled faintly of heat. Steel on the docks corroded twice as fast as before. Instruments stored indoors ticked even when the power was cut. Something continued. The Corps called it acoustic interference. The geologists called it subsurface resonance. The men who worked the water called it the low note. Whatever name it took, the sound threaded through everything, through hull plates, telegraph wire, bone. It came at night, most often just before dawn, a slow pulse rolling beneath the current. Some said it was the echo of engines. Others said it was too regular, too patient. Every 20 minutes, the vibration returned, soft enough to be doubted, strong enough to make lantern flames tremble. At first, the officers measured it. Then they began to wait for it. A corporal kept a log. 0311 felt again. 0332 stronger. Men restless. He stopped writing after the 10th entry. The next page was blank except for a fingerprint pressed into the paper, dark smudged like graphite rubbed into skin. Official correspondents tried to separate superstition from science. Gaseous pockets, one memo insisted. Temperature inversion. Magnetic deviation. Yet the explanations shifted every week following the data instead of leading it. When the Bureau of Standards tested a warped hull plate, they found the metal had twisted inward, not burst outward. Anomaly, they wrote. Direction of force indeterminate. One analyst added a private note in pencil: if pressure came from outside plate, would bend opposite. The locals didn't need reports. They could hear it in their houses, boards creaking and sequence water glasses trembling on shelves. A woman who lived near the bend wrote to her sister in Memphis, "The river knocks on the floorboards now. 3 short, 3 again. I don't answer." Her letter reached the post office, damp edges rippled as though steamed. When Monroe reviewed the telegraph records, he found that the interference matched the same rhythm: 3 short, pause, 3. The line operators joked that the river had learned Morse. But a young technician, Ellis Rowe, listened closer. He slowed the recording, played it through a gramophone horn, and swore he could hear breath between the knocks, the faint inhale of water moving through space it should not fit. The report of his finding was filed, then misplaced. Only the reel remained a thin black circle that hummed even when it shouldn't. By November, fog settled over the delta for 9 straight nights. No wind, no moon. The air itself felt thick as if filled with current. Men along the levee claimed the ground vibrated. Cattle refused to drink. One morning when the fog lifted, the reeds lay flattened in perfect concentric rings. The newspapers blamed wind shear. The locals remembered crop circles of mud appearing after the Great Flood of 1871. Patterns always returned. Inside the command tent, the officers argued geology against rumor, fact against experience. The arguments turned to whispers. Some of the younger engineers left without formal transfer. The older ones stayed not out of courage but because they couldn't imagine leaving a question unanswered. Corbett had been like that. They spoke his name less each week, yet his handwriting lingered on the margins of every chart. Sound resembles exhalation, one note said. Another barely legible under a coffee stain, river responding to frequency, not source. The final survey that year produced more confusion than clarity. Instruments recorded temperature increases of nearly 10 degrees within seconds, followed by abrupt cooling. Pressure gauges fluctuated in rhythm. The analysts overlaid the graphs and discovered the waves formed a perfect repeating curve, 6 peaks, pause, 6. It looked deliberate, mathematical, alive. Resonance of unknown origin, the caption read. In the corner, someone drew a single question mark and left it uninked, a hollow outline waiting for an answer. Washington requested closure before Christmas. Monroe wrote his summary by candlelight, no further action required. Recommend sector be classified as unstable. Beneath his signature, the candle wax pooled into the shape of a ripple spreading outward. He never noticed. The following week, heavy rain fell across the delta. The river rose 2 feet overnight, then held steady, refusing to crest or retreat. Boats anchored at the docks found their ropes tightening, as if the current pulled both directions at once. The tension snapped 2 mooring posts clean. No one reported it officially. They said the storm would explain everything soon enough. But the rain stopped, and the current kept pulling. After that, the men who stayed stopped speaking of facts at all. They spoke of feeling. They said the air itself seemed to breathe, that the mist over the water lifted and settled in rhythm. A sergeant described it as the pause before a question that never comes. Another said, it's the river thinking. Their reports were filed under subjective phenomena and quietly discarded. When winter finally broke, the hum faded. The bend froze for one brief morning, a sheen of glass over black water. At noon, the ice cracked from beneath, and the surface steamed. The sound carried for miles. It was, the meteorologists said, perfectly natural thermal expansion, nothing more. But those who heard it swore it carried a tone, a deep 3-beat chord that ended not in silence but in breath. By spring, the Corps shut the outpost. The files went north, boxed, stamped, archived. Yet the data never settled. The same intervals, the same oscillations began to appear in other rivers, smaller, fainter, like echoes. Some believed the instruments were malfunctioning. Others thought the Mississippi had taught its pattern to the land itself. Today, the surviving records lie quiet in climate-controlled rooms. The paper has yellowed. The graphs still waver. Listen long enough, and you can almost hear the low hum beneath the words, the faint continuation of what began in 1918. Not a legend, not a monster, just a sound that refused to die. A reminder that some mysteries don't end. They drift slow and patient, like the river that made them. And if you stand on that bank at night long after the barges have passed, you might feel it again, through your shoes, through your ribs. A small tremor counting the seconds between silence and memory. 3. Pause. 3. The heartbeat of the Mississippi. By the spring of 1919, the war had ended overseas, but in Mississippi another kind of silence settled, heavier, slower, and harder to explain. The Army Corps packed its equipment, folded the tents, and labeled the backwater files concluded. Yet in the quiet that followed, something still moved, not in the open current, but below it, deep under the silt where the charts stopped. The last crew to leave Vicksburg was small engineers, surveyors, men too tired to argue anymore. They carried with them boxes of instruments still ticking faintly after their batteries died. The vibrations ran through wood and metal alike, steady as a pulse. One man tried to disassemble a recorder. When he lifted the lid, the paper roll inside was blank, but it kept turning. The machine wasn't writing, it was listening. They launched a final boat at dusk, intending only to mark the remaining buoys and check current speed. The light fell low, fog rising off the water like breath. Each oar stroke echoed, then faintly. Another echo answered, slower, delayed, not theirs. The captain told the men to keep rowing. They didn't speak. No one had spoken freely on the river for weeks. At 02:13, the current went still. Clocks aboard the vessel lost a minute, then another. Their compasses spun, once paused, corrected. The hydrophones, experimental, expensive, recorded a low-frequency hum that started soft and climbed. Keene, the youngest engineer, wrote in his notebook, pattern repeating same cadence as before. Source below us. Possible vent. Then he drew a small arrow downward, and beside it, a single word, alive. What followed lasted less than a minute, but the reports describe it with impossible detail. A tremor beneath the hull. Lantern flames bending inward. The smell of hot metal like iron left on coals. The air itself thickening, pressing against their chests, until breath came short. Then, release. The boat lifted, slightly dropped, and the vibrations stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was dripping water falling back into water. When they checked the gauges, all readings were normal, every instrument silent, and yet each man swore he still felt the echo inside his ribs. By dawn, they were gone from the river. The Corps shipped the data north, sealed the crates. The official summary arrived 2 months later. Probable gas pocket. No further investigation recommended. Beneath that line, someone at the War Department had penciled in a question mark, faint, then erased it halfway. But nothing erases cleanly. Years later, archivists found that same box of instruments in storage. The labels had faded, the paper curls inside fused into long amber spirals. When handled, the rolls gave off a faint vibration. The archivist wrote in her log paper, hums when touched. She thought it was an illusion until 2 colleagues confirmed it. The box was resealed, marked "Do Not Disturb," and placed in deep archive. No one checked it again. Meanwhile, the locals learned to live with their own explanations. They said the Mississippi was still full of the war's noise shells, metal memory, and that sometimes when the fog came heavy, it replayed itself. Barge pilots reported engines sputtering over the old coordinates. Fishermen spoke of nets tightening though the water was calm. One boy decades later claimed he could feel the ground tremble at night like a train under the soil. The grown-ups told him it was imagination, but they remembered. In 1943, the Navy tested new sonar in that same stretch, unaware of the old restrictions. 3 trials failed. The equipment overheated. The recordings came back blank except for a pulse. 6 beats, pause 6. Instrument error, they said. Yet one technician reviewing the raw data noted that the pulse slowed when men approached the console as if timing itself to their breath. He refused to work the next shift. By the 1950s, the story belonged to folklore. People called it the hum under the delta, not haunting, just strange. Reporters came, wrote their pieces, moved on. But when they played back their interviews, some tapes carried a faint noise under the voices, rhythmic and soft, repeating every 20 seconds. It matched no known machine in the area. The geologists who studied the river later said the entire bend might rest over a vast hollow, a cave system filled with trapped air and water. Natural resonance, they called it. But their measurements showed something curious. The cavity's shape changed slightly each decade, growing, then shrinking again. Like breathing. And through all of this, the Mississippi never spoke directly, it only reflected. Storms came, bridges collapsed, floods rose and fell. Each event seemed to echo that summer of 1918, the same warmth, the same vibration through the soil. Locals noticed patterns. The fog would roll in thickest on anniversaries of the lost patrols, and animals would fall quiet. The rest of the year, the river was ordinary, forgiving, steady brown with silt. But every so often, for reasons no science could name, it remembered. When new technology arrived, digital sensors, satellite imaging, the hum appeared again, faint but measurable. 5 hertz, too slow for machines, too steady for chance. The analysts circled the data, shrugged, filed it away. It became a line on a graph, a leftover heartbeat buried in bureaucracy. And yet, on nights when the wind dies, the water flattens to glass, and the barges anchor far downstream, some still claim to hear it. A rhythm older than war, older than the wires and papers and men who tried to define it. Not warning, not threat, just presence. The Army's final closure memo, dated 1958, reads, "Anomaly diminished area open for navigation." But a handwritten note follows in blue ink. If it's gone, why do the instruments still move? No one signed it. Maybe that's the real ending, not discovery, not terror, but the quiet admission that something existed once and chose to stay hidden. Corbett's last field journal, recovered decades later, says it best. Every current learns the shape of what passes through it. Even when the body is gone, the motion remains. Now the motion is all that's left. At sunset, the Mississippi turns to bronze, slow light, over slower water. The air carries heat from below, that same warmth recorded a century ago. You can stand on the bank and feel it through your shoes, through the earth itself, a deep rhythm that feels alive but asks for nothing. It doesn't threaten, doesn't answer. It just continues. Some say that's what eternity sounds like. Not silence, but repetition. The low hum of the world remembering itself. The same pattern that began in 1918, still rolling through mud and current. The sound of the river and everything the river ever carried, still listening. 3. Pause. 3. Night settles over the delta like a slow exhale. The Mississippi glimmers with the color of old bronze, wide and patient, its surface carrying nothing and everything. A century has passed since the summer of 1918, the year the water was said to breathe. The war ended, the men returned home, the files were boxed and numbered, yet the story never quite sank. It lingers thin as mist folded into the hum of the current. Historians still open those boxes sometimes, careful, reverent, afraid of tearing the paper. Inside are graphs that no one can explain, tape reels that still thrum faintly when light hits them, photographs where the horizon bends ever so slightly toward the water, as if drawn by a pulse. The records speak in the language of science. But beneath the numbers, the ink feels almost human. Every generation finds the pattern again. Engineers in the 1940s, sonar teams in the 60s, satellite imaging in the 2000s, each records the same anomaly, a vibration too low to hear, too steady to ignore. The reports pile up. The words change resonance, feedback, sub-frequency, but the rhythm remains. 3. Pause. 3. A heartbeat that doesn't belong to any machine. Locals have learned not to argue. They tell visitors the river just remembers, that water never forgets what passes through it. They say that's why bridges hum before storms, why fog forms in circles, why fishermen sometimes look downstream and swear the current has stopped even while it keeps moving. A superstition maybe, or the world's oldest form of faith, the belief that nature itself keeps a diary. Some call it haunting, some call it history. But perhaps it's both the voice of a place replaying itself. What the army heard as interference, what scientists labeled as data, what old men whispered about in the dark, it's all the same sound. The sound of memory made physical. The river doesn't speak. It echoes. And when it does, it carries not the answers, but the questions that men left unfinished. Every so often, someone tries to prove it again. They lower microphones, take readings, film the water at night. The equipment malfunctions, batteries drain, static blooms. What they hear on playback isn't a voice, just the slow rhythm of something that listens. It isn't menacing. It isn't kind. It simply is. The rhythm of the planet's oldest witness, patient beyond comprehension. Perhaps the night stalker was never a creature at all. Perhaps it was the name given to the moment when humans realized they were being observed by their own world, that the river, the air, the soil beneath their boots were listening back. Maybe that's why Corbett wrote, "If the water remembers us, we must learn to remember it." A warning or a prayer? No one can tell anymore. The Mississippi runs quiet tonight. The cities have grown, the levees stretch higher, the ships larger. But under all that progress, the sound persists, steady, buried, waiting. If you stand by the shore long enough, close your eyes, let the wind fall still. You might feel it. A pressure in the chest, a tiny pulse through the soles of your shoes. 3. Pause. 3. The same cadence recorded more than 100 years ago. The same question the river keeps asking. Were you listening? Because every mystery fades into something simpler. Not terror, not revelation, but awareness. The realization that the world is larger than our explanations, deeper than our silence, and more patient than our fear. The Mississippi keeps flowing, carrying its echoes into tomorrow, whispering through mud and memory alike. Its story doesn't end, it drifts. And perhaps somewhere below the surface, the last vibration of 1918 still travels in circles, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen again. You've just listened to another record from Classified Chronicles. If you'd like to hear more, subscribe.